was 6 years ago today that I posted my first video on this channel, They Got Away with Murder, and I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking everyone who has supported me during that period in so many ways. Sometimes just by watching and silent appreciation, that can be enough. So thank you. I'd like to mark this occasion by providing my take on the Brighton trunk murders. There have been a number of these over the past 2 centuries. In the summer of 1934, there were 2 which are inextricably linked, and these are the 2 which I'll be covering today. So here's to another 6 years.
The 17th of June 1934 was a hot day, and the flies were busy in the Brighton left luggage office. The principal topic of conversation concerned a trunk which had been deposited there 11 days earlier, on the 6th of June. The smell coming from it was atrocious. At some point that afternoon, one of the attendants went and found the station policeman and told him about the trunk. Having taken a good look at the trunk and smelled the odour unquestionably coming from it, the officer knew it must be opened soon. Detective Constable Edward Taylor came on foot from Brighton Police Station, which was just a quarter of a mile away, and using his colleague's truncheon, he broke open the 2 clasps on the trunk and threw back the lid. The sudden intense smell from within caused him to reel. Inside was a large brown paper parcel, bound with cord. Pulling some of this away revealed a human torso. The head of Brighton CID, Detective Inspector Arthur Pelling, arrived minutes later and took charge. He ordered a search of the remaining luggage in the office to ascertain whether there might be other parts of the body secreted away there. It appeared there was not. An examination of the torso by the police surgeon, Dr. H. J. Pulling, at Brighton Mortuary, revealed it to be that of a young woman. He estimated that she had died 3 weeks before, but couldn't ascertain the cause of death. In addition to the torso, the trunk yielded the brown paper and 19 feet of cord which had been used to bind it, a great quantity of cotton wool, and a stained white face flannel. There was also some writing in blue pencil discovered on one of the pieces of brown wrapping paper, which resembled the word or name Ford. Detective Inspector Pelling made a public appeal for anyone who was missing a family relative or whose friend had disappeared prior to the 6th of June to contact police. The response to the appeal was overwhelming. Thousands of replies flowed in from anxious relatives of young women who had left home and not been heard from. It was a Herculean task to sort through these and try to separate the wheat from the chaff. Police inquiries turned to finding a witness who might have seen a man transporting a heavy trunk on the 6th of June. Given the trunk's size and weight, it was thought he may have required help. Meanwhile, all the left luggage officers in possible reach of Brighton were on the alert, and officers from several forces were conducting inquiries of them in an effort to locate the other parts of the body. On the 18th of June 1934, this bore fruit. At King's Cross Station, on the direct line from Brighton, a porter discovered a brown suitcase that was emitting a noxious smell. At once suspicious, in the heightened state of vigilance now governing all luggage officers, he opened the suitcase and inside found 4 brown paper packages soaked in dark oily fluids. Police were called, and the parcels in the suitcase inspected. They contained 2 legs and 2 feet. The suitcase had been deposited at King's Cross around 1:30 p.m. on the 7th of June, the day after the first trunk had been left at Brighton luggage office. A man called Cyril Escott had issued the ticket for the suitcase, but had no recollection of who had left it. An autopsy examination of the legs and feet was conducted at St. Pancras Mortuary by Sir Bernard Spilsbury. He determined that they were of a young woman who took a size 4.5 shoe, and ascertained from hair samples she had been blonde and with unusually well cared-for feet. Spilsbury also examined the torso, and although unable to ascertain the cause of death, he was able to confirm that the legs and feet found at King's Cross matched the torso. The assembled parts suggested it was a woman who had been approximately 5 feet 2 inches in height, between 21 and 28 years old, and weighed around 8.5 stone. She had also been 5 months pregnant. On Brighton's seafront, amongst the bright, sunlit cafes, brisk with trade, a light-footed waiter danced between the tables, hurrying to and fro taking orders. He was small, compact, and with his flashing smile, slicked black hair, and sallow complexion, he looked every inch the Italian waiter. His name was Tony Mancini. At some point on June the 18th, Tony had a shock. He saw a newspaper headline about a trunk, which brought him to a state of considerable turmoil. He read the details quickly, and as it sank in, a sort of incredulous enlightenment took over. His secret was safe. The case promised to be a wide-ranging investigation, and so Chief Constable Hutchinson requested that officers from Scotland Yard be sent to assist. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Donaldson and Detective Sergeant Edward Sorrell were thus dispatched to Brighton and set up their headquarters in 3 rooms at Brighton Pavilion. Their investigation focused on what seemed to be the most fruitful line of inquiry, the identity of the young woman. Inquiries were made of hospitals and nursing homes, doctors, midwives, and anyone else who might have come across a pregnant woman answering the description of the dead woman. Over 700 missing women were traced and accounted for. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. There were many tips received in the days that followed, but there was nothing which moved the investigation any closer to its objective, that of discovering who the woman was and what had happened to her. Still less who had dismembered her corpse and placed her in a trunk and suitcase. The difficulties of identifying a headless corpse became frustratingly obvious. The trunk which had contained the body was constructed of plywood, covered with brown canvas, and battened with 4 hoops, giving it structural support. The suitcase was a new, cheap case, and sold in many places throughout the country, and little could be gleaned of it. It was decided to conduct full-scale house-to-house inquiries in Brighton, paying special attention to boarding houses. It was believed that the girl had been staying temporarily in the town, either because she was rendezvousing with someone, possibly a married man, or had come to Brighton for a specific medical procedure. In either case, police considered that the 5-month pregnancy of the woman gave them the likely motive for the killing. An inquest was opened at Brighton on the 20th of June, at which the barest details of the case were outlined, and it was adjourned until the 18th of July for the police inquiry to continue. Later that same evening, police made a direct appeal to the public on BBC Radio for information concerning the identity of the girl and help with any aspect of the items discovered in the trunk. Amongst the endless scraps of information received by the inquiry team in Brighton Pavilion was a report that a woman called Violet Kay, who made her living as a prostitute, was missing, and that she had been living at an address in Park Crescent with her boyfriend. The police tracked him down. He was working as a waiter at a cafe on the seafront called the Skylark Cafe. His name was Tony Mancini. It gave Tony a significant jolt to be visited by the police. He had been in turmoil since he had seen the headline on the 18th of June about the trunk. He was taken to Brighton Pavilion headquarters and there seen by Inspector Donaldson. He was asked where Violet was. Mancini told him that Violet had gone abroad to work. This might have aroused suspicions, but when Tony pointed out that Violet Kay was 42 years old, Donaldson realized she couldn't possibly be the girl in the trunk who was in her 20s. Mancini was thus dismissed from inquiries, but he became thoughtful. Something was bothering him. He didn't return to the cafe to work that day, and he didn't go home. It was the following day after this interview that a painter and decorator working at 52 Kemp Street in Brighton first noticed it. The smell. It was coming from a basement in the house and was getting worse in the hot July weather. It was reported to the police. When Detective Inspector Pelling and Chief Inspector Donaldson arrived at Kemp Street, the smell was of such a distinctive nature they knew immediately they must force entry to the house. Upon entering the basement of the property, they discovered a black trunk in the bedroom, from which fluid was leaching ominously. It was bound several times over with cord, and Pelling ordered the trunk to be opened. Detective Constable Ed Taylor, who had opened the first trunk, was again given this privilege. Cut the cord and opened it. At once a draught of the odour of fetid decay caused the detectives to recoil. A coat, sopping with mildew, was lifted from the top of the trunk, and there, beneath it, lay the corpse of a woman, head bowed and legs drawn up in fetal position. Detective Chief Inspector Pelling had expected to discover the head and arms of the woman whose torso and legs had been discovered a month before. Now, opening the trunk at 52 Kemp Street, he was astonished to discover the complete corpse of another woman. The crime scene was secured, and soon the area was teeming with sightseers and reporters, as rumours spread that a second murdered woman had been discovered. Sir Bernard Spilsbury came from London, arriving in Brighton by car that afternoon. He was met by Chief Constable Hutchinson and travelled directly to the Park Street mortuary. Here he undertook a post-mortem examination of the body. It took him 3 hours, grim work, but Spilsbury had 30 years' experience of this. It was unlikely to put him off his dinner. Various organs were removed and placed in jars and sealed for analysis by the Home Office analyst Dr. Roche Lynch. When the work was done, Sir Bernard had a conference with detectives. His main finding was that the woman had been killed by a single blow to the head, probably administered while the head was resting against a hard surface like the floor. The investigation into the second trunk murder moved quickly. Only the previous day, of course, Inspector Donaldson had interviewed the occupant of the basement flat at 52 Kemp Road, Tony Mancini, in connection with the earlier trunk murder. Now here was the flat in which Mancini lived, found to contain the remains of another dead woman concealed in a black trunk, and Mancini was nowhere to be found. The landlord told police Mancini had occupied the flat for the past 2 months, and inquiries at the Skylark Cafe indicated that Mancini had not turned up for work that morning. Furthermore, it was learned that, until 2 months ago, Mancini had been living with the woman named Violet Kay at another house in Park Crescent, and that she had suddenly disappeared around the 10th of May. Detectives considered whether this was related to the earlier trunk murder, but decided that the 2 cases were quite different. Although both had been discovered in Brighton in trunks, the sum of the differences was greater. One had been dismembered and deposited at 2 stations, and one had been crammed into a trunk and retained in a flat. It seemed to be an incredible coincidence. Nevertheless, the identity of this second woman was clear enough. Violet Kay had been living with Tony Mancini, and she had disappeared 2 months ago. Now the body of a woman had turned up in Mancini's flat. A formal identification made by Mrs. Watts, Violet's mother, confirmed that the corpse was that of her daughter. Violet Kay was born Violet Watts on the 14th of March, 1892, in Peckham, southeast London. At 14 she became a comedienne and dancer, calling herself Violet Kay, a name she retained for professional purposes for the rest of her life. Initially, she enjoyed some stage success and toured extensively throughout the country. Whilst appearing in South Wales, she married a Pontypridd miner named George Saunders. It was a short-lived marriage, but resulted in the birth of a son, Bernard, born at Brighton when she was still just 19. She continued her career on stage and appeared as part of a dual act called K and K, with Kay Fredericks, a prominent member of the British Union of Fascists, the two living together at 2 Angel Road, Brixton, as Mr. and Mrs. Fredericks from 1930 on. They parted in 1933, by which time Violet had taken to supplementing her income by prostitution, and she appeared in court for importuning in 1933. She worked as a waitress, too, and her family, who were accustomed to her fleeting visits, gradually saw less and less of her, until by 1934 only her sister Olive was still in touch with her. By now Violet was 41, and had graduated from showbiz to full-time prostitution. It was at this time she met another young man, one not much older than her own son, Tony Mancini. Mancini described himself as British Italian and liked to associate with petty gangsters and villains, and cultivated an air of charm and studied menace. He had a string of convictions to his name for theft dating from 1929 and had served 2 prison sentences for these. He sometimes called himself Antoni Pirelli or Jack No-Tire. He was a good dancer, apparently, and well known in London dancing clubs. But the truth was prosaic. His real name was Cecil Lewis England, and he was born on the 7th of January 1908 at New Cross, Oxfordshire, second of 5 children to Albert England, at the time a lighterman on the Thames, later keeping a fruit shop in Camden Road, where young Cecil was known as a barrow boy. His mother was Lydia Lewis England, née Muan, Morn, or Morn, different branches of the family seemingly in dispute over how the name was spelt. It seems Mancini was a petty criminal for much of his life. It was in September 1933 that Cecil, calling himself Tony Mancini, had met Violet at Sadie's Cafe in Leicester Square. Their relationship developed quickly, and in late 1933 they moved to Brighton. By March 1934 they were living at 44 Park Crescent, off Lewes Road, Brighton, as Mr. and Mrs. Watson. Tony disappeared from the house while Mrs. Watson entertained paying gentlemen visitors in the flat. Tony was content to live off these dubious earnings, but found a job as a waiter in the Skylark Cafe on the 5th of May 1934. Then, just 5 days later, Violet disappeared. Her sister, who was planning a visit to Violet that summer, received a cursory telegram the following day, purportedly from Violet, informing her that she had gone abroad for a job and would write. Tony Mancini told various acquaintances that same day that Violet had left him, run off with her uncle, another regular visitor to the flat. The discovery of Violet's body and the disappearance of Mancini convinced detectives that he was the man they were looking for. They issued a statement intimating that they wished to question Cecil Lewis England, also known as Tony England, or English, Anthony Luigi Mancini, or Jack No-Tire, concerning the crime. He was described as 26 years old, 5 foot 6 inches tall, clean-shaven, with a dark, sallow complexion, black greased hair, and a scar to the right side of his mouth. The hunt was on. The next day, at around 1:35 a.m., Police Constable William Triplow and a colleague were patrolling in London when they spotted a forlorn man traipsing along the road. It looked like Mancini. Triplow approached him. "Hello, Sonny," he said. "Where are you going?" Mancini seemed almost relieved to be caught. He was taken to Lee Road Police Station and held. Brighton police force was at once informed, and detectives Donaldson and Pelling set off for London, escorting Mancini back to Brighton police station later that morning. On being arrested and formally charged at Brighton, he said, "All I can say, sir, is that I am not guilty." Mancini made a statement to Donaldson in which he said that in May he had returned to the Park Crescent flat and rung the bell, and failing to receive an answer, he entered by the front window. He found Violet lying on the bed with a handkerchief around her neck. She was dead, and he had panicked and concealed her body in the cupboard, later moving it to the trunk, which he transported to Kemp Street in a barrow. Mancini was charged with the murder of Violet Sanders, her correct name, appearing briefly before magistrates on the 17th of July, where he was remanded in custody pending further inquiries. He was held at Lewes Prison on remand and appeared in the name of Jack No-Tire through the various hearings, though there were a half-dozen other names, could have been used had it been desired. He is referred to throughout this essay as Tony Mancini for the sake of consistency, and because this was the name by which he was generally referred to in the press. Mancini appeared before magistrates at Brighton Police Court on the 7th of August. He was brought to the court in a police car, watched by a huge crowd, mostly, as was usual on such occasions, by women, many of whom appeared to know him, and a couple of whom called out words of encouragement, to which he smiled in brief acknowledgment. The case against him was heard in some detail, and following this, the magistrates committed Tony Mancini to stand trial at the Sussex Winter Assizes. The trial of Tony Mancini began on the 10th of December 1934 at Lewes Court. Justice Branson presided over proceedings, and J.D. Cassels appeared for the Crown. Norman Burkitt, K.C., led the defence. Securing Burkitt for the defence was a stroke of good fortune for Mancini. If there was a legal counsel who could secure an acquittal for him, then Norman Burkitt was the man to do it. His big chance came as public prosecutor in the case of the Green Bicycle murder, which saw him go up against the great defence advocate of the age, Edward Marshall Hall. Burkitt lost, but Marshall Hall recognised Burkitt's quality and invited him to become his junior in London. It was a huge opportunity to work alongside a man whose experience in murder cases was second to none, and after Marshall Hall's death in 1927, he stepped into his shoes with consummate ease. J.D. Cassels outlined the case for the prosecution. Mancini, he said, was a 26-year-old waiter. The dead woman was 42. Her body was discovered in a basement room in Kemp Street, Brighton, on the 15th of July, which had been occupied by Mancini until just a few hours previously. Medical opinion had given her cause of death as due to a violent blow to the head, which had fractured her skull. Cassels said that on the 19th of March, Mancini and Violet Kay had taken possession of a flat in Park Crescent, Brighton, where they lived as man and wife. On the 10th of May, Violet had gone to the cafe where Mancini was employed. There was an altercation between them over another woman who worked with Mancini at the cafe. A visitor to the flat that afternoon found Violet distressed, very excited, nervous and shaken, apparently under the influence of drugs, he said. She was not seen alive again. The next day, the 11th of May, a sister of Violet Kay in London received a telegram from Brighton, reading, "Going abroad. Good job. Sail Sunday. Will write. Bye." "Who wrote that telegram?" demanded Cassels. According to the handwriting expert, it was the handwriting of Tony Mancini. Mancini then bought a black trunk, which was taken by him and another man to Kemp Street, where he moved on the 14th of May, just 4 days after Violet was last seen. For 2 months, said Cassels, the body of Violet Kay had lain doubled up in a trunk in the room where Mancini slept. There was evidence the jury would hear that traces of morphine found in the dead woman were greater than would be accounted for by a medicinal dose which might be found in patent medicines available from the chemist. A hammerhead was found at Park Crescent, the shaft of which was burnt. This, he contended, was the murder weapon. "The evidence and the prisoner's conduct and conversations," declared Cassels, "point irresistibly to the conclusion that he murdered Violet Saunders." Witnesses were then called. Henry Snuggs, of 44 Park Crescent, said he let the basement flat of his house to Mancini and a woman whom he knew as Mr. and Mrs. Watson. He spoke of a tall, elderly male visitor who was referred to as Uncle. He had last seen Violet Kay on the 7th of May, when she paid him the rent. On the 14th of May he saw Mancini in company with a young woman, whom he introduced as his sister. Burkitt rose to cross-examine Snuggs, and his line of questioning was at once suggestive of the line the defence would take. "You have seen the man come who has been called Charlie Moores?" he asked. "Yes," said Snuggs. "Did you hear the dead woman refer to that man as Uncle?" "Yes." "Rather a strange man, was he not?" "Well, I never saw enough of him." "You know he is now in an asylum?" Burkitt's job was done. He had established that Violet Kay entertained clients who frequented lunatic asylums. It was good groundwork. Norman Hall, a cobbler, told the court that he had occupied the flat at Park Crescent up until February 1934. He had left behind a hammer with a broken shaft. but the condition of the burnt hammer produced made it impossible for him to identify it. A Brighton stallholder identified the trunk as being one he had sold to Mancini in May, and Thomas Caplin told the court he had gone to Park Crescent in mid-May to move Mancini's luggage, including a large trunk, to Kemp Street. He said it was very heavy, and they had moved it in a wheelbarrow. Olive Watts, Violet's sister, appeared dressed in black. She testified that she had been intending to visit her sister to stay, but had received a telegram on the 11th of May putting her off. Shown the original writing in which the telegram had been submitted to Brighton Post Office, she said it was not her sister's handwriting, and the address was spelt wrong. Gerard Francis Curran, handwriting expert, said he had examined Mancini's handwriting and concluded it was the same as that on the telegram submission. Dr. Gerard Roche-Lynch, the senior Home Office analyst, spoke concerning spots of blood he found on some of Mancini's clothes. A hammerhead had been burned, he said, so it was not possible to discern whether there had been traces of blood on it. His analysis relating to the discovery of morphine in the dead woman's organs and stomach indicated that the quantity taken exceeded what would be expected in a medicinal dose, he said. The likely result of this would mean she was probably in a deep sleep when struck. Various items of women's clothing and cutlery were shown to the court, and female witnesses declared they had been given these by Mancini following Violet's disappearance. Miss Joyce Golding had a particularly difficult time in court. She gave her occupation as waitress, and said that Mancini had told her he had quarrelled with Violet, and she had left him to go to France. She said, "I asked whether he missed her, and he said no, they had been quarrelling, and now there would be no more following him in the streets and calling him names. One night he asked me to go to a show, and suggested I should live with him. He said he was earning between £3 and £4 a week with tips. I said no." Cross-examined by Burkett, she admitted she had not actually worked as a waitress for some years. Burkett then adjusted his glasses, and after a long pause said apologetically, "I'm sorry to have to do this. How do you live?" Joyce Golding blushed. "The best way I could." "What way was that?" There was a long, painful silence. "On the streets," said Joyce Golding. Burkett said, "I am sorry about this. I put it to you that it is a deliberate lie to say he ever invited you to go and live with him." "He invited me," Joyce retorted, "for the simple reason that he knew what I was." Burkett also accused her of lying in saying he told her he had quarrelled with his wife, but she insisted he had done so several times. Then came a dramatic exchange as Burkett attempted to break Miss Golding's damaging testimony. He suggested that she had read a great deal about the case. She denied this, saying she was not much interested in it. "Interested, madam?" thundered Burkett. "You had known him all these years. On your own testimony he had asked you to live with him. Do you mean to say you did not read with eagerness every word about him?" He had done his best, given the circumstances, and managed to bring to the jury's attention her mode of living and the distinct likelihood that she might be lying. Elizabeth Attrill, former waitress at the Skylark Cafe, said that on the 10th of May Mancini had given her a cup of tea. Violet was in the cafe and was annoyed at this apparent show of affection. They argued. "They had words," she said, "and my name was mentioned several times. He told me not to take notice of her, as she was jealous." On the following day she had gone dancing with Mancini, and he told her Violet had gone to Paris. She said that a shirt she had washed for him had a blood stain on it, and when she queried it, he said he had cut himself shaving. John Cochrane, attendant at Aladdin's Cave, Brighton, said he was told by Mancini, "I've had a dust-up with the missus. I've given her the biggest hiding she ever had in her life." Frederick Coftree, present on this occasion, said Mancini had also added, "I bashed her from pillar to post." George Boxall, also privy to this conversation, went further, claiming Mancini had said, "Why knock a woman about with your hands? You only hurt yourself. Hit them with a hammer and slosh her out the same as I did." Things were not going well for Tony Mancini. The prosecution evidence was relentless, and Burkett was struggling to discredit the witnesses whose evidence seemed to suggest that Mancini had murdered Violet. Nor did Mancini's situation improve that morning when Sir Bernard Spilsbury appeared for the Crown case. The courtroom was hushed as he held in his hands a human skull to demonstrate to the court the nature of Violet Kay's fatal injuries. He spoke to his post-mortem examination of Violet, conducted on the 15th of July at Brighton mortuary. While he continued with his evidence in court, the skull remained perched on the witness box ledge, grinning at proceedings, a grim reminder of the occupation of the man speaking and of the business of the court. He produced a piece of bone which he said had been removed from the deceased woman's skull. He said the injury had been caused by a violent blow struck with a blunt instrument, made when the dead woman's head was resting against a hard surface. He said that either end of the shoemaker's hammer could have been responsible for inflicting the wound. The fractured bone had cut through an artery in a groove beneath the skull, and would have resulted in a considerable rush of blood as soon as the fracture was inflicted. He said this would have resulted in immediate unconsciousness and death soon afterwards. Questioned by Cassells, he said that death had not resulted from morphine poisoning, and that the blow was unquestionably administered during life. Cross-examined by Burkett, he said it was possible to recover from such injuries. "I suggest to you," said Burkett, "that if someone fell from the top step of the flight leading to the basement where Violet Kay lived, or the second step, or thereabouts, with violence onto the iron rail, it could produce such a depressed fracture." Spilsbury replied tersely, "I think it is impossible." 17-year-old Doris Saville testified that she had stayed at a woman's lodging house in Stepney in July and met Mancini. He had asked her to give him an alibi and to tell police that she had seen Violet at Park Crescent with 3 men, and later she and Mancini had found Violet dead. The prosecution was over. Burkett now rose to present the defence case. Quoting from Edward Fitzgerald's liberal translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, he warned the jury with great solemnity, "The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit can lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it." This, he implied, was the consequence a guilty verdict would bring to Tony Mancini. He said it was quite possible the woman had fallen down the steps and hit her head on a projecting window ledge, nor could her being killed by someone else be excluded. With these admonitions and cautions to the jury, he called Tony Mancini to give evidence on his own behalf in the witness box. Mancini told the court he had been working as a waiter in Leicester Square when he met Violet Kay. They lived together, and he left the flat when she entertained men. She provided for him until he found work in May 1934. Burkett asked him, "Did she appear to be in fear?" "Yes," Tony replied. "Some evenings I would be at home. She would come home and say, 'Quick, pack up your clothes. We've got to go.' We were always moving, and she appeared to be in fear all the time." Then Burkett asked him, "During the whole time you lived with her as man and wife, how did you get on together?" "Strange as it is, I used to love her," replied Mancini. "We were always on the most affectionate terms. There were no quarrels." "Did that cover the whole time?" "Yes, every second she was alive." He said he had come home on the fateful day and discovered Violet on the bed. She was clutching a handful of sheets in one hand. I thought she was asleep and shook her. Then I saw blood on the pillow. I put my hand on her heart, and it didn't beat. I thought she must be dead." "How did that affect your mind?" queried Burkett. "I was crazy." Burkett then asked why he did not go to the police. Speaking very deliberately, Mancini replied, "I consider that a man who has been convicted never gets a fair and square deal from the police. I thought the police would say, 'You must be the man. You have been living with her. You're a convicted man and you found her.' I decided that the only course was to keep it a secret until I could, if possible, find out what had killed her." He then told the silent, thrilled courtroom how he had folded clothes around the body and put it in a cupboard, fastening the door with a nail, later placing it in the trunk. He denied Doris Savile's claim that he had sought an alibi from her, nor that he had spoken of a murder at all to her. He said he had never seen the hammer and had no knowledge of it at all. His examination by his own counsel was benign and designed to forestall any adverse points accruing from the prosecution case. Now Cassels cross-examined Mancini. "When you heard she was dead, why did you not call assistance of any kind?" "Because I was afraid, as it is now proved, I should be blamed for it." "Perhaps with reason." "There was no reason." "You found lying on the bed a woman of whom you were so fond, and you thought she was asleep," persisted Cassels. "Yes," replied Mancini. "Were you satisfied she was dead?" "I put my hand on her heart and listened to it. I couldn't hear anything at all." "Were you satisfied she had been killed?" "That was the conclusion I came to." "But you called no assistance?" "No, I'm sorry." He told Cassels he put Violet's body into the cupboard because he could not stand the sight of her on the bed. He admitted he had sent the telegram to Violet's sister, saying she was going abroad, that he had passed Elizabeth Attrell off as his sister, because the landlord might otherwise have thought it strange. He also admitted he had told various people Violet had gone to Paris, but he denied the claims of the 3 men from Aladdin's cave, that he had spoken of violence towards Violet. Addressing the jury for the last time, Norman Burkitt showed why he was the foremost defence barrister of the day. The case for the Crown, he said, was that Mancini took a hammer and killed the woman, but it had provided no reason at all as to why he might have done this. It was the vital question, and yet it had been met by the prosecution with a resounding silence. "I submit," he declared, "that this vital omission in the case for the Crown destroys it. All the evidence before the death of Violet Kay is that they were friendly, affectionate, had no quarrels. This case is riddled with doubt. Is it not a most astounding thing that a case in which there was morphine in the victim's body, perhaps a fatal dose, the prisoner was not asked a single question about it in the box?" Casting his net wide upon the water, he added, "What part now does morphine play in the theory of the Crown? Is he responsible for it? If it is to be suggested that he was, he should have been asked about it." He pointed out that various people had said Violet took drugs, or appeared to be under the influence of drugs. Where she got them from whom, and why, ought to give the jury reasonable doubt that the prosecution case was deficient. He criticised the evidence of Spilsbury and Roche Lynch, and pressed the case for Violet having fallen down the steps. "Bring your evidence of human life to bear on the matter," he flattered them, "when experts tell you this is impossible." He then said he wished to lay stress on another possibility on which, he said, the evidence is very strong. This was the notion that someone else killed Violet Kay. He knew no such person, but it was worthy of the jury's attention and consideration. "I ask you for, I appeal to you for, and I claim from you a verdict of not guilty." Mr. Cassels, rising for the prosecution, said it was not necessary to establish motive in the case. The concealment of the body was the outstanding feature of the case. His restatement of the prosecution case was an anticlimax following the soul-searing pulpit oratory of Norman Burkitt, K.C. Justice Branson summed up by reminding the jury they needed to be satisfied of the prisoner's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to return a guilty verdict. He alluded to Mancini living off the woman's immoral earnings. "This is not a court of morals. You must not allow the natural revulsion which one feels to affect your judgment against this man. If you are not satisfied that she died from the blow upon her head, then you should immediately acquit the prisoner." He also said, "Ask yourself, can you imagine an innocent man dealing in this way with the woman whom he says he loved? According to him, he comes in and finds the woman dead, not yet cold. Then he put her in the cupboard and nailed it up. What do you think of that as the action of an innocent man?" The jury retired to consider its verdict. It took them 2 hours and 15 minutes to do so, and upon their return the foreman informed the court it was not guilty. The judge made no comment upon the verdict, nor did he thank the jury. He spoke just 3 words. "You are discharged," he said to Mancini. There was a strong murmur in the gallery in response to the verdict, a quizzical approval, perhaps. Mancini raised his hand to his head, dazed, and was led from the dock. His father buried his face in his hands for a few moments, then suddenly, with decision, rose swiftly and left the courtroom. He went directly to the room where his wife was waiting, unable to bear the tension of the impending verdict, narrowing the options for her son. Her husband opened the door to the room where she waited, and she knew immediately from his face the outcome. "Thank God!" she cried in an outpouring of emotion. "I knew my son was innocent." The happy parents, reprieved by the verdict from what might follow, returned to the back of the court arm in arm, where they reclaimed their son. It was all over. Eventually they left the courthouse in a car with blinds covering the windows. It was all over, but someone had murdered Violet Kay on the 10th of May, 1934. Who was it? It must have seemed to the police and the prosecuting counsel as straightforward a case of murder as could be wished for. Under almost any other circumstance, the discovery of a body concealed in a trunk in an apartment where the person suspected of the crime lived would have resulted in a hanging in 1934. But there were 2 factors which told against the prosecution case here. First was the story of Tony Mancini, which by happenstance or intuition was the only one which could conceivably have saved him. The second was the skill of the barrister Norman Burkett, who probed the weaknesses of the prosecution case masterfully. The prosecution case, at its heart, depended on 5 things for its success. 1. That Tony Mancini and Violet Kay had quarrelled hours before her death. 2. That she had died from a blow to the head, administered by a cobbler's hammer, known to be present in the house where the murder occurred. 3. That Tony Mancini had failed to inform anyone of Violet's death, concealed her body first in a cupboard at the flat, and then, purchasing a trunk, had concealed it in this, taking the trunk to a new address with him. 4. That he had sent a telegram the morning after the murder to deter her sister from visiting Violet, and had told several people that Violet had gone abroad. 5. That 3 people said he had told them of his violence towards Violet. This should have been enough. If Tony Mancini denied this in its entirety, it probably would have been. But he didn't. His defence was one of intuitive genius, and it disarmed the prosecution case of its most telling points. Tony Mancini admitted to every major claim made by the prosecution, except to that of murder itself. The evidence of the quarrel before the death of Violet alluded only to Violet's aggression, not to Tony's. He had simply deflected her anger, instructing Elizabeth Attrell apologetically to take no notice of Violet's jealousy. Others who spoke of Tony's quarrels with Violet alluded to her unreasonable behaviour, calling names after him in the street, but not his. Nor did the claim that Violet had died from a blow to the head from a cobbler's hammer assist much in the prosecution case. Tony did not deny that Violet had died from a blow to the head, or from anything else. He had simply found her dead. The cause of her death was outside of his knowledge. Cassels tried to draw him on what he thought she had died of, but Tony spoke only of checking for a pulse, and finding none. That Mancini found the body and failed to inform anyone, concealing the body in a trunk he purchased for the purpose, was a major part of the prosecution case. But the reason he gave for this was that he panicked and believed that as a man with previous convictions, he would not receive a fair deal from the police. His reason may not have been wholly believable, but it was an easy one to understand, and it made it possible that in a heightened moment of panic, a man in his position might act in such a way. Mancini sent a telegram the morning after Violet's death to her sister to forestall her impending visit. Prima facie, this was a damning piece of evidence. but it was neutralized because Tony admitted he had sent the telegram. He was afraid and knew he must take steps to prevent the sister from visiting. He diminished the value of this evidence considerably, and this applied to those conversations he had with various witnesses who testified Tony had told them Violet had left him, gone to France. The 3 witnesses from the Aladdin's cave in Brighton who testified that Mancini had bragged of his violence against Violet were dangerous to his case, but in this he was fortunate. None of the 3 men were characters in whom much trust could be placed. Tony made a virtue of being a reprobate. The people with whom he associated were from that underworld, as Burkitt termed it, of drug addicts, prostitutes and their clients, men who shielded their faces as they visited Violet at night, women who walked the dark streets, looking for men like Uncle Charlie Moores, who spent most of the year in an insane asylum. What others might there be lurking unseen in the shadows of Violet Kay's life? Poor Joyce Golding, who gave her evidence that Mancini had told her he did not miss Violet because she shouted names after him in the street, was doomed from the outset. She gave her profession as waitress, and this elicited from Burkitt an apology, as he mercilessly forced her to admit she was a prostitute, and from here questioned her truthfulness about her statements until she was forced into the corner of stating that she was not much interested in the case and had read nothing about it. It was a catastrophic error. She lied, and it is easy to see why she did so. She was intelligent enough to realize where Burkitt's line of questioning was going, to try to protect her veracity in this single point, but not clever enough to see the dangers of lying to protect her word. Burkitt easily exposed the lie. His pulpit style of damnation worked thrillingly in the court to all who witnessed it. They could not fail to be struck by the absurdity of the woman's claim to have no interest in the case. He then, with perfect counterpoint, lowered his voice to one of grave rebuke, intoning, "You realize that this man is on trial for murder." Such was his mastery of the theatre of the courtroom. These were, he made abundantly clear, a subclass of people whose word could not be trusted, and especially where a man's life depended on it. It was an unsatisfactory outcome for the prosecution, who had constructed a case which prima facie had seemed so airtight. Ultimately, the wind was taken out of their sails by the defence's agreement on the majority of the carefully constructed proofs. It meant that the prosecutors stood in court, labouring points on which there was no great divergence of opinion. A man was called from the market to give evidence that a black trunk had been purchased by Mancini, but Mancini concurred in this. A man gave evidence that Mancini and he had taken that trunk to Kemp Street, but Mancini was in full agreement with him on this. The telegram had been written by Mancini, insisted a handwriting expert. Mancini agreed. The sister, Olive Watts, said it was not her sister's handwriting. Mancini said it was his. He had misspelt the name of the address, she said. What did this matter? He had already accepted he had written the telegram. So much time was expended in court proving matters that were not in dispute, that it must have seemed rather meaningless, because in the end the article in dispute was the claim that Mancini had murdered Violet Kay. It was the prosecution's contention that the sum of all these circumstances indicated that he did. Mancini's defense was simply that they might appear to be damning, but that there was a single coherent alternative reason underwriting all of these improbabilities. Was his version possible? The jury decided that it was, and that saved Tony Mancini from the gallows in 1934. It was a difficult decision for the jury. The stakes were high. An adverse decision would result in a mandatory death sentence. Tony Mancini was on trial for his life. If found guilty, he could expect no delay in the administration of the death penalty. There were no extenuating circumstances that had been presented in court. Mancini was not a man of exemplary character, a boy of good family, or any of those things that might prevail upon a Home Secretary to grant clemency. He was a reprobate. The law hangs such people. It is its purpose. But if the jury made such a decision, based on a fine calibration of the terrible risks of sending a bad but innocent man to the gallows, we are not bound by such strictures. And the evidence against Tony Mancini is compelling. First, there had been a quarrel earlier that day, one of many such quarrels between them. The fact that Violet was chiefly the instigator of these does not affect that. It provided the foundation for what followed. Second, Tony did not return to discover Violet dead on the bed and think her asleep. She was clutching papers in her hand. A temporal artery was severed. There was blood about the flat. How could that be mistaken for an attitude of repose? Had she been on the mattress, as he claimed, it would have been destroyed by the blood. She must have been on the floor, where it could be cleaned up. Third, had Mancini discovered Violet lying in bed or on the floor dead, he would have acted with fright. It would be intuitive to raise the alarm, to call for assistance from others, without regard for the consequences of what the police might think. Such a reflective attitude would only come later. Fourth, that he concealed Violet's body in the cupboard and nailed it shut is not the act of an innocent panicked man, but of a guilty panicked man. He was seeking concealment of something he had done, not something he had discovered. And nor, as the judge pointed out, does one nail the body of a woman one professes to love in a cupboard. Fifth, he acted quickly and with guile, sending a telegram to her sister, Olive, to forestall her visit and informing her friends she had gone to France. He was quick to develop a plan which was entirely concerned with his own self-preservation. And finally, 3 men at Aladdin's cave all gave similar accounts of Tony's espousal of violence towards Violet, but all were sufficiently different to remove any suspicion of collusion in them. Did they lie? All 3 of them? Why would they? These things strongly suggest Tony Mancini did indeed get away with the murder of Violet Kay in 1934, and the narrative of events which unfold only reinforced this. There was a great disparity in the ages of Violet and Mancini. She was 42, he was 26. Violet was a jealous woman. Her jealousy could only be exacerbated by that age difference. She was a temporary fixture in his life, and she feared it. Tony seemed to have a way with women. He was popular and a good dancer. He was a familiar figure on the seedier social scene. In the few months he had been in Brighton, he had become known as the dancing man for his dance floor expertise. He spent a lot of time in the cafes and dance clubs of the town, and for the 10 months the couple lived in Brighton up until her death, Tony had no income other than that Violet gave him from her earnings as a prostitute. His social life was funded entirely by Violet. It gave her a hold on him. Perhaps she sensed this. It would be extraordinary if she did not, because here was a young man, attractive to younger women, who spent a great deal of time in Brighton's clubs. It was a situation in which jealousy would be constantly simmering. But there was one single constraint upon it. Tony had no means of living other than by Violet, and in this she had Tony on a tether, a long tether, but one which he could not, for the time being, escape. But all that changed on the 5th of May 1934, because on that day, just 5 days before her death, Tony Mancini got a job at the Skylark Cafe. It was the commencement of the summer season at Brighton, and many of the seaside resorts, cafes and bars, shut up for winter, were opening again in anticipation of the increase in summer trade. Tony had a job, and Violet had lost that gossamer fine thread by which she had him tethered to her all winter. It could only increase her anxiety, her jealous watchfulness of Tony, that his persistent straying would result in some greater breach. Because it would. And Tony knew this too. He no longer needed to be home at certain times, nor did he have to go to her cap in hand to ask her for money when he wanted to go to a cafe or club to dance with young women on the seafront. The day of her death, in fact, he received his first wage packet, his first financial freedom in more than 10 months. In anticipation of this, his enterprise was increasing. Starting the job as a waiter, he had come across a 17-year-old waitress, Elizabeth Attrell. Tall, attractive, and obviously taken with him. He was seen dancing with Elizabeth on the night after Violet's death. He was hardly grieving. 2 days later she was at Tony's flat, while Violet lay nailed up in the cupboard. In those 5 days at the Skylark Cafe, Tony Mancini had developed a crush on Elizabeth Attrell, and she on him. Now he had money. He was a man of means, who earned £3 to £4 per week, including tips, we're told. He also had a missus, a possessive woman of definite temperament, who used drugs recreationally, which seems to have exacerbated her temperament, and her jealousy sometimes verged on paranoia. And so it was on the afternoon of the 10th of May, 1934. Violet visited the Skylark Cafe. Perhaps it was to keep an eye on Tony. She didn't like what she saw there. Her jealousy was heightened by Tony's newfound independence and by the fact she had taken morphine, which would have released her from natural social inhibitions. On the 10th of May she was wild-eyed, dangerous in the cafe. She was watching Tony. She saw his flirtations with Elizabeth Attrell, and saw Elizabeth's flirtatious denials, her coquettish rebukes, her pretend admonitions of his liberties with her, and naturally she saw much more. She was a woman of the world. She knew all the tricks a woman can employ, the tossing of her head and young dark curls, her self-conscious walk when Tony was around, her infuriating giggle, and the way, perhaps, she tightened the apron round her neat waist a little. It enraged her. She had words with Tony, and a row broke out. The extent of that row is known only from the accounts given by Elizabeth Attrell and Tony Mancini. But as Violet Kay was a woman who shouted in the street at him, she would hardly have shown much restraint in the cafe. Hers were not whispered complaints to Tony. This was not a public library, and she was not a quiet or sober woman. She was a loud stage performer, a comedienne, and a woman who made her living on street corners. They argued, and the outcome was that she left angrily and returned home. It is possible that as Tony did not have a key, she intended not to allow him back into the flat. It would be a natural move on her part, one she had probably employed before when he had been out too late into the early hours, or if she suspected him of being with another woman. This was, from his point of view, quite unreasonable, as she spent a good deal of the night entertaining men at their flat and in their bed. But of course reason has nothing to do with such matters. Their relations were business from which they both benefited, and in any case, it was he who was breaching the status quo. Whatever the situation, Tony could not gain admittance to the house, so he entered by the front window. He had left it unlatched with such an exigency in mind. As Tony had no key, it would be a natural precaution to ensure he could gain entry in the event she would not answer the door to him or was absent from the house. He made use of this now. He entered the flat. Tony Mancini did not find Violet Kay dead on the bed. He found her alive and under the influence of drugs, aggressive, maddened by jealousy, outraged at his appearance in her flat. She told him to get out. A row developed immediately, which would have become physical. He hit her, very much as he told the 3 companions at the Aladdin's cave he did, probably with the hammer, a single blow with crushing force that did its job immediately. She was knocked unconscious, and life would have been extinct within minutes. She cannot have fallen onto the bed because the mattress would have been destroyed by the quantity of blood on it. She fell on the floor, and it was here she died. Now it may truly be said that Mancini panicked. His account hereafter does not need to be false concerning his movements in the next few days, and this fact strengthens his case when the matter comes to court. because a lie dressed in so much circumstantial truth is the best possible kind of lie. Tony Mancini said he went out for a walk to clear his head, to think what should be done. That seems believable. He was in a state of shock. He had murdered Violet Kay, and she was currently lying on the floor of the flat they shared. Many people knew she lived there. The flat was in her name, and she paid the rent. Her sister is planning to visit her imminently. He thinks of these things as he walks through the Brighton streets, and Tony's nerves are calmed by degrees. He knows he must act. There are 3 immediate problems he has. There will be longer-term ones, but for now there is the matter of imminent apprehension. The body is the greatest problem. It provides the damning proof of murder. Tony resolves upon a course of action which will dictate all that follows. Returning to the flat, he places the body in the cupboard in the bedroom. Fearful of anyone entering the room and finding the body, he nails this shut to prevent any casual discovery, probably with the same hammer, now cleaned, with which he has killed her. It has removed the most pressing problem, but there are others. He fears her sister could arrive any day. He does not know the precise arrangements the 2 sisters have made, and if this should happen, he realizes that an immediate suspicion would form in Olive's mind, because Violet had left without informing her. There is only one thing he can do, and he does this. First thing in the morning he goes to the post office at 8 a.m. because he knows this is urgent, and he writes a telegram which he dispatches to Olive, ostensibly from Violet, saying she has a job abroad. He has thus blocked the risk of her travelling to Brighton on a visit, and also provided for her informing her sister, promising to write soon. That she will never write to her sister again is a problem for another day. The third immediate problem Tony faces is that a woman like Violet naturally has many acquaintances. Her absence will attract comment. He deals with this by telling people that she has left him and gone abroad for a job. It is, for now, accepted. But it cannot last. The body in the cupboard cannot stay there. His solution is to go to Brighton Market and buy a large black travelling trunk. Into this, before the 14th of May, but after rigor mortis has passed off, he places the doubled-up body of his dead lover. Then he moves to a new residence, 52 Kemp Street, to sever his association with the place of the murder and Violet. And because the trunk is too heavy, he borrows a hand-barrow to move it, and then he wheels the trunk through the streets of Brighton. At the new flat in Kemp Street, the trunk is placed in the corner of the room, a constant reminder of an unresolved problem. But Tony inhabits a fool's paradise. It was a great shock to Mancini when in mid-June he saw a newspaper headline, "Trunk discovered with body." His mind must have darted to the Kemp Street basement flat and to an open trunk there, crawling with flies and policemen. Reporters outside, a crowd gathered. But it was, incredibly, another trunk which had been discovered. Life went on. He read about the other trunk murder and the police investigations avidly. Who was the woman? Did he know her? Now her legs were discovered. She was a younger woman, a dancer, they thought, from her feet. Had he danced with her? He danced with so many women. The trunk began to smell. A little at first, and then worse, much worse. He used colognes to freshen the air, sprinkled them liberally, but there was a heavier scent upon the air, the scent of death, and of its inevitable aftermath, decay. Visitors to the flat noticed it. It was getting worse. Fluids were leaching from the base of the trunk. The smell was atrocious, and it could not be stemmed. And still he slept there, and woke to its presence. Then another shock. The police wanted to talk to him. They wished to interview him about the trunk murder. Which one? His mind was again filled with anxiety, concealed behind a casual pretense of smiling calm. He saw Donaldson. He wanted to know about Violet. Where was she? In other words, was she in the trunk? Yes, but not that one. But Violet was 20 years too old for the woman. She was a showgirl. She had gone abroad on a contract. Such things happen in that transient world of show people. He let it go. Violet was not the woman in the trunk. All day long he thought of this after he had left Donaldson. He went out that night with 2 men to an all-night cafe. He couldn't bear the flat with its stench. He was at the cafe all night, putting off the evil moment of decision. He could not go back to the flat. To his companions he seemed quite normal, but in his mind he was holding back an enormous truth. When he walked out of the cafe at 5:15 a.m., it was light. The sun was coming up. He went to London and stayed in a Salvation Army hostel in Limehouse. It was a temporary measure. His life was one of temporary measures, of putting off the evil moment. Still he held off the reality. He met a girl, Doris Saville. She was young. He had lived off the charity of women all his life. Now he sought to trade his charm and the attractions he held for such women for an alibi, to confect a story. He succeeded, and arranged to meet her later that evening. But his hopes were declining. He knew arrest was now a matter of time. The ports were being watched. Every policeman in the country was on the alert for the sensational trunk murderer. He was a hunted man. He could smell the scent of death upon his clothes. The smell of the basement flat he had slept in for weeks now was permanently etched into his mind. The scent was in the fabric of his clothes. That night he did not meet Doris. He walked through the streets. He was alone. A murderer is always alone. Now he was exhausted, too tired to think, and hungry. A police car in the road where he walked pulled up. He was vaguely aware of it. "Hello, Sonny. Where are you going?" said a voice. He got into the car gratefully. He had only one defence left. There remained, of course, the other matter, that of the headless torso and its lower limbs, still missing a head. The woman was never identified. The case was never resolved. Amongst those who came within the purview of DCI Donaldson's interest were medical people. There was a strong and reasonable conviction amongst detectives that the pregnancy of the woman provided the motive for the murder. This meant, almost inevitably, that the woman had died as a result of administering drugs intended to produce a miscarriage. Inquiries made of doctors and midwives of young women who had been pregnant, or who had sought advice from them on their condition, produced no results. Police turned their attention to those doctors who offered the illegal service from the fringes. According to the crime writer Jonathan Goodman, writing 40 years ago, Dr. Edward Sayce Messiah drew Donaldson's attention. This man had practices in Portland Place in London, and at 8 Brunswick Square at Hove. Messiah was a highly qualified doctor, born in 1880, and had studied at Glasgow and Edinburgh. He had a glittering future in medicine, but had gone astray. Why he did so it is not known. His family history was a long one of Scottish pedigree, but he was described as being of mixed race. In the early 20th century such things mattered. He had acquired a string of letters from which he could gain no commensurate employment. He tried America, but was soon back in England, filling in, picking up the scraps from others' tables. He took a position as an army medical officer and travelled to Guyana in West Africa. War shook things up. He was in Palestine. Back in Britain, he began to work, offering his services to young women in terminating unwanted pregnancies. It was quite illegal, and it made him persona non grata to all but those who required the discretion of his services. It was inevitable that Dr. Messiah's name in this connection would come to the attention of police. He was a man whose practice was founded on doing what others would not, on what the law forbade, and Inspector Donaldson wondered if one of Messiah's operations had gone wrong. Was it possible that someone had died? Messiah regularly travelled between Brighton and King's Cross. He had the means of transport and the facility to dismember the body of a young woman. According to Jonathan Goodman, a senior officer from Brighton spoke to Messiah about the matter, inquiring of him directly, and Messiah responded by furnishing him with a list of names and addresses of prominent people who would support him against the police. The senior officer was scared off by this, and Donaldson was left empty-handed. Goodman claimed that Donaldson had told him of this in a telephone conversation in the 1960s. It must be said that there was no evidence to support the idea that Messiah had been associated with or responsible for the death of the young woman in the trunk. Donaldson probably had reason to include Messiah in his inquiries. 2 years later, in 1935, he investigated the death of a young woman whom Messiah clearly supplied the drug intended to induce a miscarriage in her. Messiah gave unsatisfactory evidence in court concerning this. According to the Daily Herald, a woman shouted out, "Liar!" to one of his answers. He claimed one injection he had given the woman was for liver extractions. There was something very unsatisfactory about Dr. Messiah. There are many inferences that can be drawn from this episode, but nothing beyond his being a possible suspect in the case of the first trunk murder. After this incident, Messiah was quite ruined, even in the insalubrious circles he inhabited. He suffered financially, began to sell off his possessions, including a car, and in 1938 he returned to the West Indies, where he continued to practice in some capacity until his 70s. He died in the 1950s. Was Messiah responsible for the first trunk murder? It is possible. No more. After the trial and his release, Tony Mancini married Amelia May Wood, whom he had met at Aladdin's Cave. It didn't last. Just a year afterwards he was in the news again, when he was arrested and charged with the theft of a gold watch in company with a young woman called Olga Clark, and he received a 12-month jail sentence. It seems Mancini was a petty criminal for much of his life. There is a postscript to the story of Tony Mancini. In 1976 he appeared one last time in the press when an article in the News of the World newspaper entitled "I Got Away with Murder" appeared. Here he told his story of what had happened 42 years earlier, on the 10th of May 1934. He said that when he arrived home at the flat in Kemp Road, there was a row, and Violet had attacked him with the hammer, which he had wrested from her, and he threw it at her. It hit her on the left temple, and he killed her. Whether it occurred exactly as Mancini claimed is open to question, but I can see no reason to doubt the gist of his account. In light of his confession, consideration was given to charging Mancini with perjury by the Director of Public Prosecutions, the double jeopardy rule then protecting him from being tried a second time for the murder of Violet. It was decided in the end it was best to let sleeping dogs lie. The prospects for a successful prosecution were low. Cecil Lewis England, or Tony Mancini as he liked to be known, died in April 1987 in Croydon, London. He was 79 years old.